703rd contact. Wednesday, 14th of February 2018, 21:53 hours. Contact reports volume, issue, 16, Plejadisch-Plejarische Kontaktberichte block 16. Pages, 307 to 330, contact number 681 to 709 from May 17, 2017 to July 29, 2018. Translators, DeepL Translator auto-translation, Joseph Darmanin. Date of original translation, Thursday, 18th of February 2021. This is the entire contact report. It is an authorized but unofficial DeepL preliminary English translation and most probably contains errors. Contact persons.
Ptaah.
Greetings, Ptaah, dear friend. Have been expecting you, for Enjana and Florena told me last night that you would come today. Be welcome though.
Yes, I know, Eduard, but greetings to you too, and thanks for your welcome. Florena and Enjana have sent me various things to read, which will now take some time if I am to answer them in some detail.
I suppose it will, especially just this in relation to the 70th contact report, which still goes back to statements made by your daughter Semjace. Some people suspect errors in it, while others are probably trying to find errors and inconsistencies in it, which is why I thought some things should be cleared up by you.
This is as it has always been, because there are also persons at work here who either suspect faults or have doubts about everything, but on the other hand there are also always elements who suspect lies and deceit behind everything and think they are predestined to have to uncover fraud. But for this matter now arising, which has absolutely no errors because the information provided by my daughter Semjace is correct, I have decided, for once, it will not be another time, to provide some clarification. This is because, on the one hand, the questioners obviously do not think far enough when historical facts are told, that they usually come about with historical time interruptions and with factual shifts, as a result of which certain facts are omitted, others are unclearly expressed or shifted. This was also the case with Semjace when she revealed to you some of our ancient Plejaren history, which I will now clarify in some detail, and to do this, you should open the corresponding 70th conversation report section in the computer, which Enjana and Florena also copied and handed over to me. I will now give you all the necessary explanations at the relevant parts of the conversation report, which you should immediately insert into the existing copy report. On the other hand, it is also the case that know-it-alls and adversaries always work towards describing any ambiguities, which arise precisely through narrative facts, as lies and deception, because they are hopelessly trapped in their know-it-all and adversary stupidity as well as in their pathological antagonist delusion and are incapable of judgment.
That is certainly as you say, and I do not think we need to say any more about that. But good. The computer is already switched on, and the corresponding excerpt of the conversation ... Wait, there it is. So you are good to go.
You are only to write what I say and not ask any questions because I only want to dictate and state what you are to insert in writing explaining at the appropriate places.
I think it will be good if I write all that you explain in red. Note: in this printed block of Plejadisch-Plejarische contact reports these explanations are highlighted by a well-distinguishable typeface and numbered separately.
This will be good. Then it gives a good overview, and you can start here at sentence 89 and write the following.
70th contact, Thursday, 6th of January 1977, 00:01 hours.
But while the vicious extermination battles were raging on all three homeworlds, a large group of dissident scientists came together under the leadership of a certain Pelagan, who already had the status of Age twice.
This was the Titan Pelagan the Imperious, who was a power leader of the Hamad dynasty. which ruled over all the Plejaren peoples of all the Plejaren planets until before the creation of peace some 52,000 years ago. Under his leadership, 70,000 human beings, including a great many scientists, gathered together, seized various spaceships and fled from the Plejaren planets. According to the coordinates of ancient records, the refugees arrived in this space-time structure and the Sol system, and thus once again to Earth, where the Titans settled once more. According to earthly chronology, this was about 190,000 years ago, about 194,770 years.
The unpeaceful warlike times triggered by Pelagon the Commanding and continued by all his successors for about 39,000 years, led to peace and quiet returning only about 150,000 years ago, which, however, did not last long. Millennia later, about 6,000 years after the establishment of peace, tranquility and freedom, a scientist and distant descendant of Pelagon the Imperious named Pelagon the Militant set out again, in imitation, to become the leader of a 70,000 strong fighting unit that was in his thrall. These fighting units were a fighting force of 70,000 men, which had been in existence since time immemorial, were permanently mobile for security operations and combat actions, and were each under the command of a leader of the Hamad dynasty appointed for the purpose. Pelagon the Commanding was a great-great-great-great ancestor of Pelagon the Militant, who some 40,000 years later, that is some 150,000 years ago, equally brought a 70,000-man fighting unit under his command and fled to the Dern universe. This happened while his son Pelagon the Marshal was seizing power on the home planets at the same time. Pelagon the Marshal was a scientist and surrounded by many followers and also leader of another 70,000-man Hamad dynasty fighting force with which he plunged the worlds into warfare again, as this was then continued by all his numerous successors. These periods of strife then lasted for more than 100,000 years. When Pelagon the Militant, the father of Pelagon the Marshal, seized several large ships with the help of his battle unit and fled, the Dimension Gate had already existed for about 30 million years, which he used to penetrate the various inhabited solar or planetary systems in the Dern universe with his battle unit and finally also reached Earth. There, however, in the course of time, feuds and conquests broke out among some of the fighters, as well as acts of war were carried out, as a result of which it was finally decided by some of the prudent ones that the fighters should no longer be allowed to remain on the planet. So, after the death of Pelagon the Marshal, who was killed in battle, there was a general forced departure from Earth of the troublesome and quarrelsome outcasts, whereby everything that indicated their former existence had to be destroyed. The outcasts, however, fled to distant systems where they resettled, while those who remained on Earth fell under the command and Hamad leadership of Pelagon the Patriarchal.
On the home planets, the vicious war was fought to the bitter end and the scientists were put in their place. The form of government was abolished and placed in the hands of spirit leaders who reproclaimed the long-forgotten spiritual teachings and taught the peoples. These recognized the value of the teaching, adopted it and lived by it from then on, after which they found final peace some 50,000 years ago and from then on lived according to the law and commandment of absolute creative destiny, which has remained so to this day and will never change.
The times of strife and war ended only about 52,000 years ago, when the unrest and battles were finally fought out for the last time, and all the troublemakers and warmongers were finally put in their place and then final peace, freedom and tranquility were created. So the unrest and warfare which, after the short period of peace lasting only about 6,000 years 150,000 years ago, lasted again for more than 100,000 years, after which, about 52,000 years ago, the peace, freedom and tranquility which has lasted until today and will certainly last in the future was actually created. However, during the 100,000 years of unrest and warfare, Many events also followed, which were triggered by the refugees under Pelagon the Militant on Earth, where they had found their way. After the death of Pelagon the Militant, other Hamad leaders took over his legacy, after which the early refugees and their successors went in and out of Earth from 150,000 years ago until 52,000 years ago, and were also temporarily resident on Earth.
In the course of the next 8,000 years the Plejaren folks, as they were called from then on, developed to a very high spiritual and consciousness level, as a result of which they allied themselves with all kinds of foreign and own peoples in near and far systems and lived in harmony only of evolution. Thus they developed together into a great alliance, as a result of which they carried out new expeditions and, 51,951 years ago of the terrestrial calendar, found a half-spirit world in the galaxy of Andromeda, which was inhabited by half-spirit beings, an already extremely highly developed life form, which existed and still exists only semi-materially, but therefore already half-spiritually. In best agreement with these life forms, all agreed that in future they should guide the destinies of their peoples and their great government with their gigantic knowledge and wisdom, which was joyfully welcomed by all peoples. Consequently, in agreement with the spirit guides, who were human life forms and spirit teachers, it was decided that all destinies should henceforth be directed by these half-spirit forms who had made themselves the best of friends. The form of guidance was to be that of a council from a higher spirit level, which is why this guidance and leadership was called High Council, which has remained so to this day and will never change. Since then all peoples of all races connected with us have been under the guidance of the High Council, which never gives any orders, but only a High Council, which each individual life form is free to follow and which is also usually followed without exception. For the time being, those who had fled to Earth knew nothing of the end of the wars.
These refugees were Titans and the most distant descendants of the 70,000 refugees of Pelagon the Imperious, who brought them from the Plejaren planets to the Dern universe and the Sol system to Earth more than 190,000 years ago.
In the joy of their newfound freedom, they gladly submitted to Pelagon's tight regiment, who had chosen 200 scientists as sub-leaders and assigned them according to their fields of knowledge.
Pelagon the Patriarchal was the first successor leader to carry on the legacy of Pelagon the Commanding, who was then followed by various other Hamad leaders.
Under their leadership, large cities and other inhabited areas with a very high culture were created on Earth on all continents that had been formed only about 300 million years ago by continental drift. For about 10,000 years there was harmony and peace, but then a new Zwisch named Jesus arose who murdered Pelagon's successor and seized power over all the different peoples and races united at that time. After only 20 years, however, the people rose up against Jesus, and a terrible and worldwide war broke out again over the Earth through the far travelers. Many hundreds of thousands fled into open space in ships large and small, and settled in another space-time structure near Beta Centaurus, which you know in your space-time structure as Barnard's star.
This was not in the Dern universe space-time structure, but in the one where the Plejaren planets also exist.
A few million human beings remained on Earth, where everything that had been built by the extraterrestrial human beings had been completely destroyed and totally eliminated. Those left behind, deprived of all technical and other cultural possibilities by the total destruction, gradually fell into an evil lethargy, withered away and became savage beings in an evil barbarism.
All knowledge of their original origins and highly developed technology was lost, and their former high development of consciousness atrophied almost completely, with the result that in the course of time the 2.5 million feral titans largely exterminated themselves and became cannibals.
For 700 years, Earth was simply avoided before the descendants of the fugitives set out again to repopulate the beautiful blue world.
These new arrivals, or the distant descendants of those who had left the Earth earlier, were on the one hand not titans, but human beings of smaller dimensions, but they too were not exactly of a peaceful nature, but nevertheless no longer as warlike as their ancestors.
This was 133,000 Earth years ago according to today's calendar. The leadership of the returners had a Shish named Atlant, married to a Shish named Caryatide. Under the leadership of Atlant, the continent of Atlantis, which had been approached and used again and again for many millennia, was expanded and made habitable, while under the rule of his wife Caryatide Clan Atlantis found its existence, at the same time that through her cousin Moras the gigantic city of Mu was built, which, like Atlantis, also found its origin at very early times. The reason for building these cities at such a great distance was that the human beings had become wiser through all the wars and hoped for peace in the great distances of the cities if all remained in their realms. So it also went well for many years, a whole 1,800 years to be exact. Then, however, a few scientists, inflamed by the desire for power, rose up again and tried to seize the reins.
After the death of Atlant, his wife Caryatide and Moras, various other leaders took over.
This time, however, they had not reckoned with the people's war memory, which had been handed down through the ages.
The law was only maintained by those who returned, but not by those who remained on Earth, who were deprived of all achievements and values by a complete destruction of all technical, cultural and other things, whereby they finally gradually withered away and became savage beings who fell into barbarism and eventually died out.
Before the scientists could strike, the people rose up against them. Through helpers, the scientists, who started the new uprising, gained possession of starships and fled to the space-time displaced areas near Beta Centaurus. That was 115,000 Earth years ago. After 2,000 years, during which the malicious fugitives again created a high technology for themselves and begat many descendants, they returned to Earth filled with hatred, after they had increased their hatred against the extraterrestrial Earth inhabitants to an immeasurable extent and were only able to maintain order in their own ranks with terrible punishments. Incited by their inhuman hatred, they pushed up their age to more than 1,000 years through research and the knowledge they gained through it. Their only desire, however, was to gain dominion over the Earth, for which reason every one of them was instructed in vicious intrigues and in the craft of war. After 2,000 years, this hate-soaked people had reached the point where they could dare to attack Earth, so they manned their ships and came to Earth once more, under the leadership of Arius, the barbarian. This happened 113,000 years ago. Arius was of a most bestial and barbarous disposition, and his might was feared. Like Pelagon thousands of years ago, Arius also had with him 200 scientists of high degrees, whom he made sub-leaders. In a blitz they fell upon Earth, raiding, murdering and robbing the land. Mainly they conquered the vast land in the Nordic regions, where the climate was temperate and very good. These were the regions which have been handed down to you as Hyperborea and which were very far north before an earth upheaval shifted the Earth's axis, so that the regions which you call Florida are there today. There from the north Aru's son Aru II set out and invaded those lands which you now call India, Pakistan, and Persia, etc., going back to the earliest times, where they met the earliest ancestors of the Sumerians, who, being peace-loving, fled and settled far to the south, a people of dark complexion, but in your terms not Negrid, but Europid and of great stature, sprung from a race of the former Syrian refugees, who also settled on Earth 133,000 years ago in a like of the Plejari refugees. According to the naming of Arius II, today's India was then called Aryan, which, however, after a few centuries seceded from Hyperborea, after 210 years to be exact, and allied itself with the inhabitants of Mu and Agartha, while Arius I from Hyperborea constantly harassed Mu and Greater Atlantis with evil acts of war in order to become their master. For about half a millennium, or more precisely for 502 years, these acts of war continued before Arius I, who had become old and weak in the meantime, succeeded in infiltrating evil elements of his hate-mongers into the leading ruling classes of Atlantis and Mu, who, as well as their descendants, then secretly fomented violence and hatred for several centuries until Mu and Atlantis could be completely destroyed by boundless intrigues a few centuries later. while only a few survivors were beaten into servitude. Great scientists, on the other hand, knowing of things to come and aware of their powerlessness, set out in spaceships and fled to former homeworlds in the Pleiades systems, where they were warmly welcomed.
Only small peoples remained on Earth, whose ancestors had long since mixed with early Earth human beings who had emerged from Earth's development and created their own cultures.
I do not need to mention the destruction of Atlantis and Mu again, for you will find them as a separate record in the explanations given to you. So it only remains for me to report that Arius XI, in his old days as a very distant descendant of Arius I, was assassinated by his third-born son, Jahavan, some millennia later and about a millennium after the destruction of Mu and Atlantis, after which he took over the rule of the Hate people to rule them as well as 3 Earth peoples and the Hyperboreans themselves. The 1 Earth people were the very distant descendants of the Armas people who had lived where the lands of Armenia are today. These were the descendants of the twice Armas, who settled there with their race 133,000 years ago, having emigrated from the Plejaren systems.
These descendants were already genetically aligned with Earth human beings in such a way that their primordial origin was no longer ascertainable. Consequently, their original origin from the Plejaren planets 133,000 years ago and their development in terms of hereditary traits and characteristics as well as dependent elements could no longer be proven.
With this, dear friend, everything should now really be clarified and nothing more should be questioned. If, however, such unpleasantness should occur again, then I will not go into it again, and by no means again. On the other hand, however, I will not hold back from correcting mistakes when they occur, as we have also done so far.
That is clear, but thank you very much for your effort and your clarification of what has now been added. But can I now ask you about what should be decided regarding the matter I asked on behalf of the General Assembly?
We discussed this in the committee and decided that if such a case arises with the core group in the Mother Center, in which founding members are also included, then such a case is to be handled according to the statutes Art. 11, I, 1, 4, 7, 9a, as the statutes Art. 5, 4.a, 1, 4, 7, and also point 9, c, prescribe. This cannot be discussed in a knowing way, because the articles of the statutes and bylaws are clear in this respect.
Then that is also clear. Thanks, also to all the contributors to the panel. It is probably not necessary to elaborate further on the matter, because all that is important is how to act in such a case that has been raised. Then I have something pleasing here, namely this article.
Why the accusations against Billy's beamship photographs are not only baseless but absolutely moronic.
Nowadays, accusations against Billy keep surfacing regarding the beamship photographs from the 70s and 80s of the last century, with the pathetic attempt to defame them as forgeries, respectively to denigrate Billy Edward Albert Meyer as a charlatan. When the crybabies and know-it-alls then perhaps base their supposed revelations on pictures they downloaded from the internet, my hat goes off as a trained filmmaker, and the question arises whether the denunciators are really that stupid or whether their thirst for recognition has burnt up every last iota of intelligence. It is very easy in this day and age to classify photos or films as banal. We live in a time when almost everyone carries around a mobile phone that has a built-in digital camera that not only delivers razor-sharp photos, but also films HD or even UHD video footage and allows the content to be uploaded instantly to the internet or other mobile services. Then there are image editing and cutting programs that offer every private user undreamt of possibilities for manipulation. No wonder, then, that over the course of time, images and film footage have lost all justification as evidence. But this was not always the case. While today the Hollywood film industry is able to create perfect illusions by means of modern technology, even the Dream Factory in the 1970s, when Billy just published his first jet ship shots, had its difficulties in staging science fiction films credibly. It is therefore more than amusing that Billy, who has or had no special means, is credited with such a trapeze act. Billy made his first film recordings in February 1975. At that time, only Super 8 cameras were available for private use, which Billy also used for his film recordings. In contrast to professional cinema film productions, where the camera at that time exposed a 35mm negative film from which the final film positive was then made for projection by means of several optical copying processes, Super 8 can be thought of as similar to slide film. The film material exposed in the camera is a reversal, that is a color film, which was also developed as such in the laboratory and then returned to the customer. There were no intermediate copies. What you filmed in the camera, you also got back. Super 8 film was introduced to the market by Kodak in 1965 as the successor format to normal 8 film and enjoyed great popularity in the private sector for holiday films, family celebrations and similar events. The system was of interest to private users because of its ease of use. The film was delivered sealed in a cassette, which only had to be inserted into the camera for exposure and then sent to the laboratory for development. It was impossible to rewind an already exposed cassette in order to perform a double exposure or other optical tricks, as Beam is accused of doing. It was similarly impossible for private individuals to produce credible photo fakes. In the 1970s and 1980s, analog photo montages could only be produced with equipment costing millions, and then with quality smears that would not have stood up to analysis. Today's popular Photoshop was not developed until 1988 by Thomas Knoll and his brother John, years after Billy took the last of his beam ships. If Billy had been able to produce such fakes, he would be a millionaire running a special effects company that would make giants like Industrial Light and Magic and Weta Digital look old. But nothing of the sort. Billy Edward Albert Meyer lives a modest, secluded life on his estate in Hinterschmidt and works persistently to spread the spiritual teachings, the teachings of life and truth, without making a big fuss about his personality. An image that does not at all correspond to the portrayal of his personality in the mainstream media, if they publish reports about Billy and his association fig at all. Because what cannot be, must not be. But what if everything Billy says is true? All religions, sectarians, politicians, lobbyists, industrialists etc. would lose their might and our society would come apart at the seams. So the truth must be muzzled by all means, no matter how flimsy, moronic and stupid the arguments, but also for the politicians, lobbyists, secret service agents, sectarians, industrialists etc. who want to control the world according to their degenerated ideas. There will one day literally be a bitter awakening, whether they like it or not. The spirit form taught by Billy, also called the doctrine of life, teaches the rebirth of the immortal spirit form together with a block of consciousness and a new personality. Every clear-thinking human being becomes aware of this fact on clear observation of nature and its laws. Everything material is subject to a constant cycle of becoming and passing away, a creative law which earth human beings are also unable to escape. This means that even the most unscrupulous man of power cannot escape the consequences of his actions and that one day he will have to eke out his existence again in the world he helped to destroy, because his spirit form will be reborn, in a new personality and in a new environment, but on the same planet. Critics should instead be concerned with the question of why Billy and his extraterrestrial friends are taking all this upon themselves. What are they trying to tell us? What do they have to tell us that they were doing so much to themselves? Would it not be wiser to focus our energy on really fundamental questions that redefine our existence, our way of life, even our future as humanity, instead of defaming a selfless herald like this? After all, if you look at the history of Earth human beings, we have not exactly covered ourselves in glory, and it is clear that we cannot continue in this way. So I urge every Billy critic to leave beamships or UFO photos behind for once and rather deal with the content of the message that the Plejaren are sharing with us together with Billy without prejudice. Everyone is free to accept this information or not. But those who develop an interest in these significant questions will eventually no longer worry about such banalities as beamships and their photos.
Harold Skisman, Austria, 12th of February 2018.
What do you think?
Like the Statesman article written by Joe Tisk, this article created by Harold Skisman is indeed extremely enjoyable, and both articles correspond to a great counter-value to what Florena has oriented me about, namely the very stupid and unusually low-level, low-consciousness, slanderous and lie-wrapped accusations of the new adversary ... who accuses you of lying, cheating as well as swindling and charlatanry. This confused man ... cannot cope with the fact that neither I nor you have responded to his desire for his madness concerning Wilhelm Reich's orgone theory, which is why he, stupidly ridiculous and obviously retarded in terms of reason, dares to harass your brothers and sisters etc. As a result, this is because he contacted your former wife and that of your sons who slandered you and told him outrageous tall tales which he, as a totally judgmentless ignoramus, mistook for fact and truth. As Florena told you, she made an effort to continuously monitor and control the man with a control device for 12 days, in order to then evaluate the control data as a trained psychologist and expert in all empirical sciences. According to her analysis, she summarized the data briefly and found that the man was ... small-minded and not really educated, but pathologically conceited, well-read, but absolutely ignorant of any reality and lived in his self-created fantasy world. In this respect, as an alien to reality, he is psychotic and completely uneducated with regard to a valuable and dependent development of consciousness and, as a result, absolutely incapable of judgment with regard to effective reality and the truth given with it. Consequently, he has no ability whatsoever to come to terms with actual reality, which is why it is also impossible for him to work out a definition between lie and truth. Consequently, he is absolutely incapable of making a truthful judgment between lie and truth. Connected with this is a deeply rooted confused faith due to the lack of judgment between reality and unreality, which is why on the one hand he indulges in lies and delusions, imagining them as given truth, but on the other hand considers effective truth to be lies and deception. All this is connected with his pathological self-conceit, his egoism and his bossiness, whereby he tries to cover up these bad factors with his self-aggrandizement, as well as the fact that he fundamentally lacks any self-respect, which he tries to cover up with his conceit about himself and his own self-aggrandizement. These observations correspond to the empirical findings that Florena has worked out from the records of the controller. For my part, I also came to the same and some more serious unevaluations from the analysis when I evaluated the control recordings for my part as well, but also to mention my further findings should probably be superfluous, because alone the analytical findings made by Florena show sufficiently which ways of thinking, behavior and which character etc. are peculiar to the man.
If I have anything to say about it, I find that such a human being is a pathetic wretch whose rotten machinations I will not concern myself with and will not deal with. I have heard Florena say to his dirty and illogical actions and doings and to his blindly believing and trusting the lies of my ex-wife and my younger wayward son, he who believes lies and liars becomes a liar himself.
With that she chose the correct words. Consequently you can judge this man ... also in that way.
He will make a fool of himself and reveal himself as a liar if he spreads, as he intends to do, his lies and slanders on the internet, probably on Facebook.
That will be so, for small-minded people are not able to judge with foresight what they are doing and conjuring up against themselves when they carry out thoughtlessly stupid and pathetically ridiculous actions, for intellect and reason are sorely lacking in such human beings.
That is so, but now I would like to come back to something I am always asked about. Yesterday I had someone on the phone again and they asked me what all the UFO sightings and UFO and alien experiences were about that were so numerous years ago and also still are today. Well, yesterday I was asked, because cases of UFO observations and alien encounters etc. are becoming public again and again, especially in the USA, whether I really could not say and explain anything about it, because it is known that I know more than I would admit. We have often talked about this, mostly privately, and you have always explained to me how far these reports corresponded to reality or how much they were fanciful, but you have repeatedly explained that a large number of the statements were and are true. It is true that you have privately told me things that I have to keep to myself, which is why we only talk about them vaguely and knowingly in open conversations and keep quiet about what really is. It is to be said, however, that these happenings with regard to observations of UFOs and related happenings etc. had nothing to do with those alleged sightings, observations and experiences etc., which you at first regarded as genuine in the past as a result of false information and false judgments etc., but later, according to your exact clarifications, recognized as lies, fraud, hoax, charlatanry, deceptions and hallucinations and also described them as such. Well, according to your instructions, I simply answered the telephone inquiry, as usual, in such a way that the records of UFO observations and UFO and alien experiences that had become known were in part actually based on genuine observations and experiences, but that in one and the other case certain deceptions and hallucinations were also involved. So I have kept to your instruction never to mention with a word what the actual origin of the corresponding objects was and is today, what effective conditions and connections exist with them and why the various indirect or direct occurrences of observations and encounters etc. are not officially confirmed but, on the contrary, the population is being hoodwinked, disinformed and deceived. This disturbs me enormously, but I guess there is nothing else to do but always beat around the bush when we talk openly about these things, which is then reflected in the reports of the talks. But it is obvious that various people have suspicions and think that I know more than I admit through your information, which is why I am asked about it. During yesterday's call, I was also asked why you do not give any open information about the Earth foreigners, who can be observed so often here on Earth, and why you do not maintain any contact with them. I answered that this was a matter that was your sole responsibility and that you knew very well why you behaved in this way. This is also the truth, but I was able to conceal what is really hidden behind everything, about which I must remain silent.
You are getting dangerously close to what may be called with these last statements, which is why I must admonish you to be careful. What you have said is very close to the limit of what you must remain silent about, which is why I can still allow what you have said to be official. But bear in mind that your silence must also continue to apply, for on the one hand the time to clarify the whole matter is not yet given, and on the other hand it is not part of your task to clarify the events and occurrences that are still considered mysterious to Earth human beings. However, if you were to do so, then your life would also be in danger again, and moreover, unpleasantness and great misfortune would thereby arise for the whole world.
I know that, and you know that I can keep silent, and I also do not make excuses. Now that I have said something that goes a little further than our usual statements on a matter, I think that this can be done, even if it is close to the limit of what is permissible. But I think that by saying something officially in this way, it will also go out into the world and be understood that I am not allowed to say anything more. And that the contact talk reports find their way out into the world once they are retrieved and written down by me, and before they are even published in book form. That is an old fact.
What you say is probably correct, but in principle we should not have discussed the whole thing even now. But you brought it all forward in such a way that on the one hand we had to talk about it, but on the other hand you were so careful in your choice of words and statements that not a word was spoken that should not have been said or that would have revealed something that must be concealed.
Exactly. But regarding basically, as you said, I wanted to inform you about this phone call and tell you that I sometimes have to ask myself how far an answer can actually go without revealing something that should not be revealed. This happens especially when I do not have the human being in front of me in person and cannot judge him or her correctly, like when I only hear the voice through the telephone.
This is indeed difficult, because hearing only the voice of human beings can be confusing, but nevertheless I know that you are always careful enough even in this way, that you never explain too much and that you are always aware of your duty of confidentiality, just as you do when questioners are face to face with you. I have never noticed that you have ever explained more to an earth human being than you were able to trust him with, and he was also able to process consciously. You have a good empathy in this respect, and besides, you are always aware of your duty of secrecy, which inhibits you from releasing information that you have to keep to yourself.
You are right, and because I have already hammered the imposed secrecy into me by teaching your father's faith, I am also not interested in appearing in public or dealing with journalists. Although I used to give information to some journalists and answered them up to a certain point when I realized that lies were not being fabricated from my explanations, I have also stopped doing so. I prefer to stay in the background and do my work in peace and silence. Besides, I must also say that I do not like a public hustle and bustle and being adored, because I cannot start anything at all with that. And besides, it would disturb me to do my work, which I like to do alone and in peace and silence.
I know that, and that also rhymes with when Agrina coined the phrase silent revolution of truth.
Maybe you can compare it to that. But now I would like to talk a little bit in detail and openly about how basically the so-called holy books came into being with regard to Christianity and Islam. Because the truth is that neither Jmanuel alias Jesus, nor Muhammad themselves made any written records of the teachings of the prophets. Only Jmanuel's disciple Judas Iscariot, not Judas Iscariot or Iscariot, knew the scriptures, while all the other disciples, contrary to all the conventional lies and claims, were just as ignorant of the scriptures as the followers around Muhammad. The records of Judas Iscariot, from which the book Al-Jmanuel was made, were finally translated into German by those who knew the scriptures, after Isa Rashid had falsified everything according to his priesthood. The Christian New Testament, however, has no connection whatsoever with the actual records of Judas Iscariot, for this corresponds to a work of lies whose origin lay long years after the time of Jmanuel and Judas Iscariot in letters of the disciples, etc., which began to circulate and from which the so-called New Testament was also finally made. These disciples' letters, however, were not written by the disciples themselves, who knew how to write and write, but were written works of scribes, to whom various disciples etc. dictated their statements according to the time of Jmanuel, which, however, were interpreted by the scribblers according to their own discretion and sense and were formulated and written accordingly. In the process, fanciful or misinterpreting things and events were added that lacked any truth content. This also happened with the Hebrews and their descendants when the first Torah and then the second Torah were written, from which the Christian Bible ultimately emerged. These holy works were also not written according to the real truth, but according to ancient stories, fables and legends, etc., which, as with all peoples of the earth, were based on assumptions, beliefs, hallucinations, fantasies, delusions, fairy tales, hopes, dreams and wishes, etc., which were nurtured by human beings over decades and centuries or even millennia. And just as the Torah, the Bible and the New Testament came about, so it was also with the Quran, which was never written after the teachings of Muhammad, but very long after his death by human beings who had neither seen the Prophet himself, nor heard his teachings, nor known him themselves. Also with Muhammad it was in truth the case that no written records of his life and teachings were made during his lifetime, but such records only came into being long decades after his death, with tremendous mendacious claims, tall tales and false doctrines being set up which in no way corresponded to the truth regarding the reality of Muhammad's teachings and life. Everything about his personality, his behavior and the doctrine of the prophets that he brought and taught was so thoroughly falsified and made into a religion that brings death and destruction to this day. The entire life story concerning Muhammad and his work has been so maliciously falsified that hardly a word corresponds to the effective reality. Muhammad neither taught nor waged wars, and those that were carried out in his name were against his will and the work of war-obsessed delusional believers who, on the one hand, misunderstood the teachings, reinterpreted them themselves and thus falsified them. On the other hand, they used their doctrine distorting and doctrine ballooning for them useful, doctrine twisting and doctrine manipulating, deliberately fallotish interpretations to further their warmongering and to be able to attribute the whole thing to the teaching and meaning of Muhammad. So they used their doctrine distorting interpretations for their warmongering favors and advantages, completely contrary to the teachings of Muhammad, who taught neither hatred, capital punishment and child marriage, nor Sharia and such nonsense, hostilities to life and inhumanities. Lying and deceitful, as it has always been since time immemorial, and the whole thing has been preserved up to the present day. It was also easy for all those who invented his life story and devalued, disfigured, distorted and twisted it in such a way in relation to Muhammad to falsify everything in a slanderous way, that only a short time later it was no longer possible to verify anything, and today it is no longer possible at all, because the effective truth about the person of Muhammad, his way of life, his teachings and his behavior in terms of morals, ethics and customs as well as his worldly conduct can no longer be verified today, precisely because of the old mendacious records and false chronological annals, the delusion of lies and slanders surrounding his personality, teachings and behavior etc. can no longer be eradicated. On the contrary, with regard to all the stories of lies and slander around Muhammad and his teachings, everything has become so ingrained in the Islamophobes and also in the Islam believers themselves that the effective truth is no longer accepted, but is reviled as lies and conspiracy theories. So it is also not accepted that the teaching of the prophets or the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, as it was already brought by Jmanuel and all four other prophets or heralds Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah and Jeremiah, which is now also taught today for the last time and spread by the Figu, is a teaching of the creative natural laws. A teaching that teaches the human being to live with all fellow human beings and all peoples in peace, freedom and justice, in humanity and love. And this ancient teaching, whose origins can be traced back to Nocademian, the universal herald who existed 9 billion years ago, also teaches that self-knowledge, consciousness, self-development, good self-esteem, empathy and healthy self-respect, etc. are of the greatest importance for the individual human being, as well as connectedness with the existence of the entire environment. The fact is, however, that with regard to Muhammad and his teachings of the prophets, unfortunately, all evil was included in the once created falsifications by delusionists, those who were greedy for power, murder and war and other delusional elements, starting with murder and manslaughter, human trafficking, child abuse, war, exploitation, torture and capital punishment, up to and including many other evils and human degradations. And out of this came religious wars and conquests in the name of faith and the ruler of heaven, etc. Child abuse was also commonplace long before the time of Muhammad the Annunciator, as was also the case with the ancient Hebrews, about which, however, silence is deliberately kept. Muhammad had denounced this through his teachings, but never succeeded in having his request for a ban on child marriage respected, even to this day. On the contrary, this part of his teaching was also falsified and denied ad infinitum, and it was even maliciously imputed to him that he himself had at least entered into a child marriage, which was later allegedly confirmed by his wife in this regard, but which was never actually the case. In truth, this child marriage lie was already rampant very early on in the first slanderous oral and then also in the first written traditions, which then also found its way into the invented and falsified life story of the prophet or annunciation and has been preserved up to the present day. But as far as the acts of war and the great bloodshed are concerned, which resulted from the falsifications of the teachings of the prophets, everything happened in the same way in the Christian world, because also in Christianity the teachings of the prophets or the teachings of truth, teachings of the Spirit, teachings of life, which Emmanuel brought, had led to catastrophes through lies, deceit and falsifications. So everything happened in the same way also in the Christian world, which led enormous war campaigns, which were even driven from Europe to Jerusalem, unleashed the Inquisition and brought unspeakable suffering and misery as well as immense hardship and innumerable deaths upon the human beings. But the whole life story of Muhammad and the teachings of the prophets he brought were thoroughly distorted beyond recognition and turned into a false doctrine for hatred, war, death, subjugation, ruin and destruction. Muhammad and Emmanuel, however, were in reality humble human beings of love, peace, freedom, justice, equality and humanity, as were also the other, earlier and predetermined prophets Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah from the same prophetic line before them. And, as I said, the old four prophets were predestined from time immemorial, as were Emmanuel and Muhammad, because they were prophets born of earth mothers from the nations and therefore not sons of God, not chosen by a God and not servants of God or such nonsense as was attributed to them in the course of time by crazy and delusional people. Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Emmanuel and Muhammad were predetermined prophets or heralds of the doctrine of the prophets or the doctrine of truth, doctrine of the Spirit, doctrine of life, which was created ages ago by the ever-first prophet or herald Nokodemian according to the creative natural laws and carried on in his spiritual lineage reincarnating over all times. But in addition to the prophets or heralds of the Nokodemian lineage, wise human beings, female and male, also always arise in all peoples, who acquire much creative natural knowledge by their own efforts and instruct the peoples, guide them and teach them the true ways of creative natural conduct of life.
What you explain also corresponds to our records of the last millennia regarding the vast earthly history of mankind, prophets and religions. In addition, I can mention that, of all the earth human beings who have brought and spread a doctrine or false doctrine in earlier or more recent times, quite confused religions and sects have arisen, some of which still exist today. Without exception, completely false life stories were deliberately invented for those who brought the teachings, the prophets, heralds, sages and knowers, as well as confused, changed and dangerous new teachings and false doctrines that had little or no connection with the original teachings and false doctrines. Consequently, since the thousands of years during which we have been observing the earth and earth human beings and registering all that is necessary and important, there is no religion and no sect that is still formed in the way it was brought according to the original teachings or false doctrines. Also every life story and teaching of every prophet, herald, knower or sage has been so maliciously and wantonly falsified after their death by chroniclers, etc., who know how to write, and by delusionists, that only extremely little or nothing at all of every life story of a prophet, herald, sage, philosopher and other great thinkers and their teachings now corresponds to what the earlier life story or teaching corresponded to. But this is not surprising, for in the earlier days, when the art of writing was reserved for the higher classes, records of events, chronicles, etc., were not checked by higher authorities for their correctness. This was still the case until more than 1,500 years ago, when earth human beings who knew how to write were still a rarity and could only be found among rulers and in higher educated circles of various kinds, while the common peoples themselves had no or only extremely rare opportunities to learn the art of reading and writing. And even after this, when 1,500 years ago the development brought about that earth human beings, also from among the peoples, became interested in writing, the great masses of peoples, which also included the craftsmen and those fighting in the armies, etc., remained ignorant of writing for a long time, for they remained generally illiterate and were not seldom even hostile to the art of writing. Today's earthly chroniclers and scholars of historical norms do not want to accept all these facts as truth, but they vehemently deny them and believe in the completely false oral and written traditions that have run through the entire earthly history of mankind since time immemorial. Subsequently, all those who doubt false chronistic and other records and traditions or can even prove their falsity and truthfulness, which were already thoroughly falsified at the time of the events and happenings with regard to their written records by the scribes' own interpretations, are insulted as liars, know-it-alls, troublemakers and malicious conspiracy theorists. And such false and falsified chronicles, traditions and records have existed since time immemorial and thus go back to far before antiquity, although such also occur after the 14th Christian calculated century and even reach into the present time and will also continue to appear. Often, such chronistic records and traditions also involved quite deliberate lies and information fraud, as is still the case today and will probably remain so. You experience this yourself through all the lies and slander that are spread about you, your mission and contacts with us Plejaren in newspapers, on television, radio, in journals and at specially organized hearings and lectures. And the fact is that these lies and calumnies have already found their way into many works of writing, books and even encyclopedias, and will be preserved until the distant future. Consequently, it is also a chronistic form in this respect, which is based on deliberate lies and deceit, whereby the people of Earth will be misled far into the future.
That was still partly the case in the century before last, and also in Europe. Even when Europeans and many people from other countries all over the world immigrated to the American continent, there were still countless people who could neither read nor write. Even today, there are still many people all over the world, also in all European countries and thus also in Switzerland, who can neither read nor write. And it is indeed the case that learning to read and write is becoming increasingly precarious for many young people and adults today, as a result of which many can no longer read a book, a journal or newspapers, but can only spell each word with great difficulty. But actually I wanted to address what Enjana photographed and beamed to you regarding prophethood, prophets, heralds and sages, because you asked me the other day if I could write something about it.
I think what you wrote is good. When I asked you about this, I had the idea that a small brochure could be created from it and that it should be given to all those who are interested and also to the participants at the passive General Assembly without payment, in order to provide clarification, because far too much is misunderstood about this by the people on Earth. In my opinion, it would be necessary for a frank word in this respect to provide the Earth people with a little more understanding also with regard to your person and to make it clear to them what they really need to understand with regard to you. You can also insert the article at our present conversation.
We can do that, of course, and I will insert my article right here at our conversation.
Interpretation of the terms prophets, prophecies, prophethood, divination, heralds and wise men, intuition, fortune-telling, clairvoyance and effectively true prediction through real vision, real future vision or probability calculation.
True prophets or heralds and wise men usually and normally arise from the peoples of the respective planets, namely by themselves recognizing the creative natural laws and commandments in the causality and in the becoming and passing away of nature, of fauna and flora, of the climate, of the universe, of human beings and of all existing things in general. Real, truthful prophets are people who, as reality thinkers and truth thinkers, perceive, recognize and acknowledge only the effective reality and the truth arising from it. In this form they become knowers who elaborate the essence of their knowledge into wisdom and thus become sages and proclaim their extensive knowledge of the creative natural moral and worldly ways of life and behavior. In this way, knowing and wise people also become prophets, for as a result of their knowledge, their wisdom, their understanding and their reason, they become capable of calculating and foreseeing even in many a relationship and of recognizing which causes lead to certain effects, just as something can be foreseen from the causality of the or all things. This then gives rise to what is known as the prophetic effect, which shows that certain effects result from certain causes. The rule is, when something is said and explained in a prophetic way for the instruction of people, that even worse things can happen in the future due to certain evil, negative and bad causes, prophetically just can and not will, because with this the possibility is automatically mentioned and given that what is prophesied can be changed for the better and good. And the fact that, as a rule, only negative things, events and effects are announced and explained through prophecies has the purpose that people should learn to progressively improve the negative causes through progressive and better, good and positive ways of thinking, acting, deeds and behavior, in order to avoid the prophesied negative effects and, on the contrary, to bring about something better, good, positive and valuable. Prophecy has absolutely nothing to do with the unnatural or supernatural and in no way with fortune-telling, for fortune-telling, which brings together numerous practices and methods, is supposedly intended,
which is of course nonsense, to predict future events, happenings and situations, etc., but also to predict happenings in the future. But also events, occurrences, incidents, happenings, encounters, episodes, incidents, occurrences, phenomena and peculiarities etc. from the present or the past, which are beyond the knowledge of those who ask fortune-tellers about them and commission them to ascertain everything fortune-tellingly. Divination, if it is to be described, falls into the subject areas of cultural history as well as religious studies or ethnology. In literature, the term mantic, ancient Greek, '=mantiktekn, is used for divination, meaning the art of interpreting the future. Divination, Latin, divinatio, is also commonly used for divination, which actually means investigation of the divine will. However, divination is not only understood as revealing the future, but also as any form of interpretation in relation to signs of alleged gods. Fortune-telling and clairvoyance are absolutely nonsensical and have nothing to do with prophecy or effective prediction, for a truthful prediction is fulfilled with 100% certainty, but only comes about through a vision of the future according to a high percentage probability calculation or through a real vision or technically founded time travel into the future. Fortune-telling and clairvoyance have nothing to do with anything other than a nonsense practice and charlatanry, even if, to the contrary, esotericism and parapsychology claim that both come about through precognition, Latin, before knowledge, whereby future events can supposedly be predicted in this way. Since the 18th century, however, this fact has no longer been open to scientific discussion. Fortune-telling has nothing to do with prognostication, which is created solely by recognizing and understanding normal causal connections that are fundamentally comprehensible to any person with understanding and reason. This is in contrast to fortune-telling, which claims to possess a knowledge of occult connections hidden from the uninformed, which enables the fortune-teller to see into the future, present or past, which of course corresponds to an absolutely imbecilic and fraudulent claim. Certain fortune-tellers claim in the same nonsensical framework that they have immediate intuitive access to knowledge about the past, present and future, just as they have a second sight or precognition. Others, on the other hand, are faking that they can interpret signs that are symbols of the future, whereby this interpretation of signs usually has two different types, one in the form in which the fortune-teller interprets events or circumstances etc. that cannot be influenced by him or her as signs that the future is coming. The first is the form in which the fortune-teller interprets events or circumstances, etc., which cannot be influenced by him, her, as signs that future events can be read out of them, whereby the whole thing is effectively caused by the fortune-teller himself, herself, according to his or her own specific rules, whereby an event is supposed to result, the course or result of which is in turn invented solely by the fortune-teller and is then understood and interpreted as coded information about the future. The first form includes, among other things, the interpretation of astrological constellations, as well as unusual weather phenomena and chiromancy or palmistry, while the second form includes card reading or the so-called throwing or placing of objects such as dice, bones, etc., and in the case of the egg oracle, of course, eggs, from which an invented fantasy answer to a previously posed future-related question is read. Even in ancient divination theory, a distinction was made between natural or immediate knowledge of the future and artificial knowledge based on the interpretation of signs by experts. A somewhat different distinction is found especially in the shamanic practices cultivated by ethnically oriented religions, which make a special classification with regard to so-called intuitive divination, in which the diviner refers only to his or her supposedly intuitive intuition from his or her spirit and its knowledge. This, whereas in an alleged possession divination, gods or other disembodied beings are said to temporarily take possession of the body and transmit messages through it. In such divination, which is supposed to be wise, the diviners claim that it is a basis of their knowledge of the future and objective laws known to them, from which they can derive accurate conclusions in individual cases, which is of course absolute nonsense. Fortune-telling is also used in connection with religious and sectarian prophecies or divinations, although this should not be understood as a real prophecy or divination. In truth, the whole of this kind of religious sectarian reference comes to the same thing, because it has been a matter of divination since time immemorial. This is precisely because the early prophecies and divinations allegedly brought by prophets and heralds were not revealed and brought by effectively real and true prophets and heralds, but by soothsayers. These alleged and effectively false prophecies or divinations were slanderously put into the mouths of the real and true prophets and heralds. Consequently, all the lies have been handed down religiously and sectarianly throughout the ages until today as naked lies. These are future-related false and lie-laden assertions for which a direct divine inspiration has been claimed by their obedient and unsophisticated believers since the existence of the religions and sects, and is still believed by today's believers. The former true prophets and prophetesses listed by the religions and sects are, on the one hand, being falsely treated and misused as God's messengers, and on the other hand, they are being attributed with ancient prophecies of various kinds which they never revealed. And if true prophetic or prophesying unveilings have been handed down, they have usually been so misleadingly falsified that the actual meaning of the revelation can hardly or no longer be defined. On the other hand, a prophet and herald, also of a female nature, was and still is understood and worshipped as a commissioned herald of a divine plan and will by the obedient, thoughtless blind believers who are incapable of making their own decisions. It should also be explained that prophecies or divinations by true prophets are directed towards the fate of a nation or the fate of several nations or even the fate of the whole of humanity. Any divination, on the other hand, usually concerns the alleged destinies of individuals and loves, etc., as well as families or smaller groups, whereby a prophecy or divination can be absolutely separated from any divination very clearly and precisely, which, however, is only possible for a knowing and realistic person, but not for religionists, sectarians, biased researchers, psychologists and others who are incapable of judgment with regard to logic, even if they call themselves scientists. Fortune-telling and clairvoyance cannot be scientifically proven to this day, as even the advanced Pleiadian sciences make it clear that it is not a real human ability and possibility. Consequently, a human being cannot divinely perceive and predict a present, future or past event, occurrence, circumstance or situation, etc., or divinely or clairvoyantly state any facts concerning the present or the past. The fact is that at the time of the alleged foresight, present vision or past vision of a fortune teller, no rational knowledge is available for the recognition of any knowledge or events etc., and no vision, recognition or knowledge can be obtained through precognition. This is because causality would have to be suspended, because precognition would have to lie before or after the event. Causality, Latin causa, cause, represents the basic relationship to the becoming of the effect, Latin, modum, in that it concerns and describes the sequence of interrelated events and states. Accordingly, The original state or the original event or an effective cause is important and responsible for the becoming of an effect, because the effect is invariably brought about by a certain cause. Fortune-telling and clairvoyance have nothing to do with prophecy, nor with intuition, which is fundamentally inherent in every rational human being. Intuition is also called immediate hunch and intuition, whereby it is not based on reflective thinking and reason cognition, that is not on an immediate, non-discursive and non-reflective cognition and comprehension of a fact or a complicated process, but on an intuition or a hunching comprehension. Intuition must generally be understood as a hunch, thought or intuition, but also as the sixth sense, the inner voice and instinct, which are based on the subconscious and come about without conscious reflection and which correspond to an impulse without its origin being able to be substantiated. Consequently, humans are unable to rationally explain intuitive gut feelings, flashes of thought or intuitive ideas, although intuition itself can be simple, clear and to the point, not convoluted, not mysterious and not long-winded. Intuition also has nothing to do with a magical sense or feeling and is not a paranormal but a completely natural process and is also not the opposite of rationality. Basically, intuition is also not a random process, but rather a process that is governed by fate. And it is also not based on assumptions. An intuition is based on knowledge stored in the subconscious, which in turn contains experience and was acquired as a result of direct conscious or unconscious contact with something perceived. However, when a person intuitively perceives something, he is still unable to explain to himself or others exactly how he finally came to the conclusion that he perceived as an intuition. Basically, however, intuition is much more than experiential knowledge, because somatic markers, mirror neurons and unconscious perception play a very important role in the whole process, as do morphological fields and their influence on intuitive processes. Although consciousness activity, the world of thoughts and feelings and psyche activism are also involved. If intuition is considered more closely, then it corresponds fundamentally to a very important human function. Consequently, it can be defined as a purpose or as a process in which many possible impressions, thoughts and fantasies are coordinated in the shortest possible time to form a picture of reality, resulting in a spontaneous holistic recognition or perception. In any case, intuition can also be experienced as sensory perception, as in relation to feeling, hearing, smelling, tasting and seeing. Also, through an intuition, the possibility arises that both the inner and the outer world can be perceived, experienced in a different way as well as much more profoundly. It can also be that something unknown is explored and possibilities are sensed that are not yet recognizable, whereby it is then a matter of a cognitive or thought-perceiving function, whereby the truth can be grasped in its entirety, whereby the whole is effectively and directly grasped through intuition and brought to realization. Unfortunately, the ability of intuition lies dormant in many people, very often as a result of complete inattention to oneself and one's own impulses, but also very often as a result of consciousness thought-feeling psychological problems that cannot be overcome and degenerate pathologically. In normal cases and when people are generally healthy, all areas of life are penetrated intuitively, but many often do not dare to listen to their intuition and act accordingly. This is because they are afraid to make their own decisions, which may have understandable reasons, but which would be relatively easy to overcome if they were master of fear and apprehension. The consequences of this negative behavior lead to a wrong attitude in the relationship of trying to shift personal decisions to the outside and to fellow human beings, organizations, groups or counseling companies etc. This defensive attitude towards one's own intuitions can be very difficult to overcome. This defensive attitude towards one's own intuitions, however, has serious and far-reaching effects, which on the one hand damage one's own person and the health of one's own consciousness, thoughts, feelings and psyche, but also the positive functioning of society as a whole. All in all, the whole thing brings about many serious wrong decisions, from the population to politics and governments, to the economy and the military, whereby enormous costs and debts are also incurred and no solutions are found for them. As a result, the increasingly frequent problems of all kinds and severity are simply postponed, becoming more and more extensive and formidable, ultimately leading to chaos and complete collapse in every respect. For every human being, intuition is fundamentally important for his or her creativity, whereby many facets come into play which are of enormous importance for progress in every relationship, especially with regard to the personal development of consciousness, personality, character, psyche, morals, morality and behavior, as well as with regard to material things and new inventions, etc. In particular, it is important that intuition be perceived first and foremost as such and that each factor be analyzed carefully by reason and intellect in order to distinguish fantasies from desires, as well as biases and emotions, etc., and to separate them from each other and judge them individually according to their effective value. In addition, intuition offers the human being the possibility of understanding the whole of the increasing complexity or the interrelation of many characteristics of intuition, which opens up diverse and new radii of action or ways of shaping and options for shaping, which allow him to make decisions better and faster and to carry out actions more efficiently. Therefore, as far as the most important aspects of intuition can be explained in relation to prophecy and prophecies, which have nothing to do with religious and sectarian beliefs or other nonsense, it follows that the religious sectarian claim that prophecy is a gift of God or a work of the Holy Spirit etc. is not only false, but also erroneous and confused, corresponding to nothing other than religious sectarian delusions. There is also no spirit of prophecy, but only a conscious awareness or real awareness, a valuable level of intelligence, a clear mind, a logical reason and ability to judge, a healthy perception and thought-feeling function as well as an intact psyche, which make a person capable of prophecy. In principle, every human being, if he consciously endeavors to expand his development of consciousness accordingly and necessarily evolutionarily, can of his own ability perceive, recognize and evaluate the Creator natural laws and commandments in free nature, in the existence of the entire environment and in life, in order to process them into knowledge and wisdom and then to submit and teach the knowledge gained and its essence, the wisdom, in a teaching and doctrinal manner and thus in a revelatory manner to fellow human beings. What man must do for this is merely to train his consciousness, his intellect and his reason, his logic, his sense of reality and truth and perception, as well as the gift of combination and the ability to calculate probability, in order to be able to determine what results from existing causes as effects, as this is determined by the creative natural law of causality. Causality, Latin causa, cause, as already explained, is the relationship between cause and effect, that is, the sequence of interrelated events and states that take place between a cause up to the effect being the achieved result of all applications and actions, etc., that take place between the cause up to the occurrence of the effect. The terms prophet and prophecy come from the Greek prophets and prophet respectively, where prophet means intercessor, messenger, forerunner or speaking forth and prophesying. The earlier origin comes from the Hebrew naba. Prophesying and prophesying basically mean the same thing and mean that a prophetic human being, man or woman, has worked out the knowledge of the causal law in relation to the creative natural laws and commandments through his or her own knowledge. Therefore, prophets and prophetesses can determine from certain causes, which in their continuation proceed logically, the effects arising from them, and in this way prophetically or revelatory or prophesying announce what the effect will be, if causally further thought and action is taken in the same style. In a prophecy, however, the rule is that not the good, positive and valuable, but only the bad, negative, bad and bad is prophesied, because if good, positive and valuable form a cause, then it is to be assumed that the whole will also continue in the same way and does not need any change. Consequently, there is no need to specifically point out to continue everything in the good, positive and valuable framework. On the contrary, there is a cause that is evil, negative, bad and bad, which is why it must be changed for the better, good, positive and valuable, whereby this is indicated by a prophecy, in that everything that is to be expected in terms of evil, negative, bad and bad is prophesied or predicted so that the human beings change everything in terms of thoughts, feelings, actions and deeds as well as behavior etc. for the better, good, positive and valuable in such a way that the prophecy cannot come true. So a prophecy does not mean a prediction of the last conclusion, but it corresponds to a reminder and warning. This should serve to make everything better, more positive and more valuable from now on, both in terms of thoughts, feelings and behavior and also in terms of ethos, morals, morality and all actions and deeds. A prophecy must therefore never be understood, as explained, as a gift from God and the like, because such divine gifts do not exist. Consequently, such assertions correspond to nothing but mindless, religious sectarian nonsense, because in every relationship each individual human being creates for himself each of his gifts, abilities and possibilities. And this is so because every human being is autonomous in himself and independent of an external deity directing him. Consequently, he alone determines in relation to himself and his consciousness, his thoughts, feelings and psyche, as well as his character and values of ethos, morality and custom. Prophecy must also not be confused with so-called occult or demonic fortune-telling, nor with any religious sectarian, threatening prophecies, which without exception belong to the realm of fantasy. Unfortunately, however, false prophets and prophetesses have appeared time and again since time immemorial, and still appear today, whereby their revelations were and are very often or even without exception of a religious sectarian nature. As in the past, their revelations today are usually based on religious sectarian fanaticism and guruism, whereby believers are caught up in following the false prophets, gurus, God's messengers, God's mouthpieces, masters and leaders, etc., as a result of their suggestive work, and fall in bondage, consequently becoming unfree, unhappy and disharmonious within themselves. Without exception, such delusionists believe themselves to be much better than their fellow human beings, whereby they also cry out for punishment, revenge and retribution etc. at every opportunity, exercise hatred or even provoke wars if a fellow human being does something wrong or nations or their rulers do not handle everything within the framework and do not cower as expected and demanded by the delusionists. A prophecy does not correspond to a prediction, because through such a prophecy something quite definite is predicted, which on the one hand has nothing to do with a prophecy and nothing to do with fortune-telling and clairvoyance, But with a real prediction it is a matter of a clear statement of something that is absolutely unchangeable and will be fulfilled 100%. On the contrary, a prophecy is usually a negative prophesying revelation for the future and, in any case, only something future that results from certain causes as an effect, which will either happen or can be avoided, depending on how thoughts are formed by the human beings between cause and effect and actions, deeds and behavior are exercised. And it results, as already explained, if the course from cause to effect remains the same and is not changed for the better, that prophecy is then fulfilled. If, however, the course of events is changed for the better, the good and the positive, then the prophecy is not fulfilled, because then the thoughts, actions and deeds, the behavior and the actions and deeds are changed for the better and the good. If, in relation to a prophecy, it now says future, then this means that no present prophecy can be made because the present only lasts a short moment, a nanosecond fraction, and consequently everything flows inexorably into the future. According to neurological and psychological studies, the duration of the present is explained in such a way that the brain processes the present in units of about 2.7 seconds, whereby the everyday language term moment represents exactly this fact. Furthermore, studies suggest that 3-second units are also important in poetry and music. For example, when it comes to recognizing rhyme and rhythm, any word that is revealed at the moment or in the future is only present at the moment it is uttered and then immediately fades into the past. The Greek word for revelation is apocalypsis and has nothing whatsoever to do with the end-time apocalypse, as is erroneously taught by religious sectarians. A prophet who reveals to human beings something negative that may happen in the future is fundamentally a herald whose heralding refers to individuals, but also to groups, a people or the whole of human beings, by which the human beings are to be encouraged to eliminate or positively correct the negative causes that have been pointed out. This is so that the threatening evil or negative and bad things from a bad cause cannot come about and thus cannot have an effect. A prophecy never means to receive prophetic impressions from a god, angel or saint etc. and to pass them on, because assertions of this kind are based on religious sectarian false teachings. Prophetic impressions, which are peculiar to prophets and prophetesses, are based on consciousness thought feeling psychomically acquired knowledge as well as on the wisdom emerging from it as an essence. These values arise from perception, knowledge and from the understanding and implementation of what has been learned, which as a rule is recognizable in its entirety as creative natural laws and commandments in free nature. Prophets and prophetesses are fundamentally, as already explained, also heralds and sages who should not simply be understood as prophets or prophetesses, but rather as heralds and sages who are fundamentally teachers and should be called as such. They are considered prophetic or prophets or prophetesses only within the framework of this, if they reveal future prophecies according to their knowledge and wisdom, which in any case are always founded in causes and in foreseeable effects. If the evil, negative and bad causes continue within the same framework and are not changed for the better, good, correct and valuable. Female and male prophethood is fundamentally exercised by completely normal human beings who, as heralds, wise men and teachers, come among the human beings and teach them, proclaiming and spreading their acquired manifold knowledge and wisdom concerning the creative natural laws and commandments and their natural modes of action. In doing so, they make sure that they use contemporary parables adapted to the understanding and reason of human beings in order to be able to explain everything to them in such a plausible way that it can be grasped, processed mentally and emotionally, and understood or comprehended. This means that prophets, heralds, wise men and teachers must be logic-minded, realistically thinking and intelligence-strengthened seekers of reality and truth, who throughout their lives, on their own initiative, perceive, recognize and learn, process and develop into effective knowledge everything that is required to learn in the general existence of the environment, in nature and in life itself. This is in order to work out and attain extensive knowledge in its essence or wisdom in order to be able to teach fellow human beings in an effectively righteous and valuable way. True prophets, who never misteach religious and sectarian nonsense, but are solely connected to reality and its truth, therefore always stand out from the peoples of the respective world, whereby they are completely normal human beings by birth, but absolutely work out all their knowledge and wisdom and love etc. through their own conscious and responsible efforts. Thus, as a rule, with extremely rare exceptions, they are not instructed or taught from birth by human beings of other star and planetary systems, but solely by themselves. In the case of the seventh line of earthly prophets from the Nokodemian line, however, history leads back to a human being of extraterrestrial origin, namely to the universal prophet or universal enunciator Nokodemian, who had created relations with Earth and consequently also came here and exercised his prophethood. In this sequence, his spirit form reincarnated 7 times in different personalities who appeared in his spirit form lineage as Nokodemian's successor prophets or successor heralds. See the book Nokodemian by Bernadette Brand, Wassermannszeet Verlag, Fig. Now, however, one more defining word is to be said with regard to wisdom, in order to make it comprehensible. Effective wisdom is a universal human ability that is timeless and based on effective knowledge. It is characterized by an unusually deep insight and knowledge of the structure of existence, of nature, of fauna and flora, of life, of society, as well as by a special knowledge of life experience, general psychological understanding and especially of the creative natural laws and commandments. For a truly wise human being, the high values of existence and life are of very special value, above all the creative natural laws and commandments as well as all virtues, especially morality, ethics, morals and natural humanity. Thus, a human being to whom wisdom is inherent has subordinated himself to an outstanding ethical moral customary basic attitude, like all the associated ways of acting and behaving. In addition, real wisdom in human beings testifies to an extraordinary flexibility and independence of consciousness thought-feeling psyche, as a result of which he is able to systematically think through all things, to gain and grasp wise insights and decisions and to make corresponding judgments. Consequently, a human being capable of wisdom can form wise words, give wise advice and behave wisely. A truly wise human being also thinks and acts more logically than is the case with a so-called ordinary mortal without a good general education, who thinks things through less thoroughly and less profoundly, precisely because the necessary facts do not occur to him as a result of his lack of education. If the wisdom of a human being is considered more closely and in comprehensive appreciation of all circumstances, then it can be seen that there is also a creative causal foresight which sometimes only proves to be correct and true utterances, counsels and reflections at intervals of time or space. Similarly, this is true for some actions and deeds that are correct but only prove to be correct in the future. Correspondingly, correctness also applies to words that a human being capable of wisdom does not utter after careful consideration, or to actions or deeds that he does not do because he knows very well that every spoken word, every action or deed would be too much and completely wrongly appropriate. Now this does not mean that a wise human being as such is to be rated more valuable or even higher than any other, but less educated human being, because the value of the human being as such does not depend on knowledge and wisdom, but on being a true human being. And every human being can be a true human being if he endeavors to lead and live his life rightly according to the creative natural laws and commandments in accordance with morals, ethics and customs, as well as all good and just behavior with regard to himself, his fellow human beings and the existence of the entire environment. And that is the case, regardless of whether he is well-read, educated, uneducated or simply a normal and simple human being. It is also a fact that every human being who leads his life in a just and righteous manner in such a way, as has just been explained, has a certain amount of knowledge and wisdom and can derive benefit from it for himself and his fellow human beings.
SSSC, 11th of February 2018, 00:30 hours. Billy.
Interpretation of ethics and ethos.
Ethics and ethos correspond to two different forms, namely ethics refers to all external human moral values of behavior that ensure that human beings can exist with each other and together. These ethics also exist in the wild among fauna and flora, and these forms of ethics are then called symbiosis and pair bonding. Ethos, in contrast to ethics, does not correspond to external behavioral values, but to the inner basic behavior of human beings with regard to their morals and customs, from which their personal sense of order, their rules of conduct and their actions and deeds also emerge.
SSSC, 27th of February 2018, 10:05 hours. Billy.
Of course, since we are speaking of it, your valuable work belongs in our official conversation, as it is also to be printed as a pamphlet and brought among the earth human beings. But there is one thing that never ceases to amaze me, how you manage to do all your work besides what you also write for us, the work related to spiritual teachings that you have produced for us and from which we extracted your last written notes from your computer 2 days ago. So far comprises 618 A4 pages, as you call them, also the nearly 8,000 pages of the same kind that you have previously written for us, during the years since 1977, with valuable teachings and lessons, are equivalent to an achievement that
It's good. It is just that I am committed to my mission and therefore I am doing my work, which I also enjoy, so I can also relax and recharge my batteries. Therefore, I do not see it as something special, and thus I see everything in a different way than those human beings who are too lazy to work, who shirk it or do everything joylessly and with reluctance when they have to do a craft and produce a certain amount of work.
What you say, I have observed very often in earth human beings, and I can only say that I cannot find such an attitude and way of acting respectful.
You are not alone in this, for many other hard-working human beings besides myself also think in the same way. Unfortunately, however, it is the case that such work-shy elements in their stupidity are not ashamed of their behavior and, as day thieves, laugh at their fellow working people and their achievements and do not notice that they are actually outcasts from society and are not accorded any respect. But now I have another question regarding next autumn, since new elections are coming up again in our country. But I would like to discuss this off the record, because ...
Of course, because ... Those of us ...
Then that's clear too, though I'll give it more thought because another idea might come up, but I'll let you know if it does.
Our advice does not have to be the be-all and end-all.
Let's see what's going on in my head for the next while. But apart from what we are discussing now, there is the following. According to the instruction you gave me more than 20 years ago, It was also again last year in a private way. I am not to get involved in any more interviews with journalists. On the one hand, I did this after your declaration 2 decades ago and also after your renewed request last year, and I have therefore kept to it. I also have no intention of answering journalists' questions again. In all this, however, a question has arisen for me, namely why you actually approached me with this instruction, because I had already decided, also out of my own interest, not to give journalists any more information in future.
I know that you made your own decision decades ago not to get involved with journalists anymore, but I still instructed you 23 years ago not to give any more information to journalists, but only to those whom you yourself consider to have absolute integrity. That was a recommendation that we had discussed and made in our committee. The reason for this was that we had investigated the general behavior of earthly journalists of both sexes with regard to a true and faithful reproduction of statements made to them as well as of effective facts, and had found that, as a rule, no honest and truthful reporting takes place. The majority of earthly journalists, that was and is our finding, is, if I will call it in your way of enumerating various terms of our findings, dishonest, lying and self-centered, following good and valuable information given to them, and valuable information given to them, arrogantly, maliciously and brazenly, as well as impertinently in callousness, ruthlessness and shamelessness as well as insolence, impotence and unscrupulousness. The truthful reporting of events that effectively occur and the passing on of information that is made known to them is dishonorably and unjustifiably disparaged, doubted, slandered as falsification and lies, and questioned as truth for the sake of self-aggrandizement, in order to elevate oneself to the heights of journalistic greatness. In this very bad way we have recognized the mendacious earthly journalism system, from which also the minority of female and male journalists have to suffer, who honestly, openly and without false, slanderous self-interpretation responsibly cultivate truthful reports of events that actually occur and the passing on of information made known to them. And what is further to be said is that especially since last year, which is why I have again asked you not to get involved in any interviews etc., efforts have again been made and will also continue to be made to contact you for information regarding our connection and also about our flying apparatus etc. These are not only journalists, but also those who belong to so-called UFO research groups, who want to carry out new studies in your and our cause, which should not be the case, and therefore you should not extend a hand to them. Since you wrote to public media all over the world in the 1940s and spread warnings about future events, which led to the first steps of the worldwide controversy that is still going on after more than 70 years, the whole thing should not start all over again. For this reason, you are to continue to keep a low profile, not only against journalism, but also with regard to all people who inquire of you in the interest of UFO research groups, military and government agencies etc.
That is clear, and so I now also know the background to why you gave me instructions not to get further involved in concerns of speaking and answering. It is sometimes good to ask questions again, because then certain facts come to light that were not really relevant before, but become important over time. And what you have now explained was actually all I wanted to know.
For my part, however, I now have something we need to discuss briefly, after which I must turn back to pressing duties and leave.
Of course, go ahead.